Welcome. I'm Robin with Plan New Hampshire, and I welcome you all here to a very special New Hampshire Gives Day webinar. We've never done this before. This is something we're trying for the first time. We have very special guest Jeff Speck with us today. And this is New Hampshire Gives, and the New Hampshire Gives is a Giving Day program. For those of you who don't know, it's a Giving Day program. It starts at 5 o'clock tonight, and it goes for 24 hours. And participating nonprofits, there are about 600 of us here in the state of New Hampshire. Out of the 8,000 nonprofits, there are about 600 of us that are participating, and it's a day to celebrate the nonprofits, a day to raise awareness of nonprofits. And also we hope that you will consider a donation to your favorite nonprofits, including Plan New Hampshire. This webinar is being recorded. And so please do mute your mics. I think most of you have. We are recording it and we will post it on our website later on this week. This webinar is not possible without the support of some very special supporters and sponsors. We have AIA New Hampshire was a great supporter, the Planners Association, Make Architects, and Robert White. But first I'd like to call on Sloan Mayer, who is actually wearing two hats. And Sloan, would you like to say a word about why AIA New Hampshire is supporting this particular event and why Make Architects is supporting this particular event? Sloan, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Robin. I'd love to say a few words. The reasons to support this organization are many. As architects, we are mostly looking at our little individual buildings, and it's wonderful to have a resource to remind us of the overarching community that our buildings reside in. And Plan New Hampshire is just such a great resource to get us to think more about the community our buildings live in, the impact they make on individuals, and they champion the efforts of those that are keeping those elements in mind when they're placing structures in the environment. And we just appreciate the fact that they are doing what they're doing. They're giving us great, what is the word I'm trying to say? They're giving us a sort of a push in the direction of community that we need and we appreciate, and we're just thankful that they're doing what they're doing. And I would wholeheartedly support anyone who would give to the organization, and please do between 5 and 5 p.m. tomorrow. Is that right? 5 p.m.
Yes.
Tonight to 5 p.m. tomorrow.
Yeah.
And also stay tuned for the merit awards that will be coming out. That Plan New Hampshire is, looks at people who are making contributions into the community with their build projects that heighten the sense of community within a town, and also create greater inclusivity with the users of those buildings. And anyway, so keep your eyes open for those awards, and please donate to Plan New Hampshire. Thank you.
Thank you, Sloan. That's awesome. Thank you. And we had also made reference to Bob White, who is a special member of the board and of Plan New Hampshire, and he contributed to this as well. And the New Hampshire Planners Association, and in your chat, we're putting a link. The Planners Association sponsor their spring conference starts tomorrow, and there's still time to register. And we've put the link to that registration in the chat for you if you would like to register. We also want to thank, as an organization, we want to thank these special organizations, the Raleigh Agency, New Hampshire Saves, and Soloway and Hollis. They are all platinum members of Plan New Hampshire, so they've given a little bit more in their membership, and we really appreciate that. And we also appreciate JSA Architects and the Croto Consulting Agency for going above and beyond in their support and in their in-kind donations to Plan New Hampshire. We really appreciate that. I'd also like to acknowledge today Heather Rowan, who is our program chair, and she helped put this together. And Stephanie Croto of Croto Consulting is behind the scenes, and she's going to be recording and doing some other technical support for this particular webinar. For those of you who don't know Plan New Hampshire, we are a small independent organization. We're a member organization. We're a 501c3 of planners and designers and builders who really care about the built environment and its impact on the community. We do have a vision of healthy and vibrant communities across the state of New Hampshire and also across northern New England because we share so many different challenges and opportunities. And our mission to fulfill that vision is to foster excellence in planning and design and development of our built environment. And our strategy to do that is by sharing information and inspiration for how communities and the built environment can contribute positively to where we live, work, and play. And this webinar is a great example of how we do that for you. What I'd like to do now is introduce our speaker, Jeff Speck. Jeff, while you're pulling up your share screen, Jeff Speck is a city planner and urban designer who advocates internationally for more walkable cities. As Director of Design at the U.S. National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 through 2007, he presided over the Mayor's Institute on City Design, and he created the Governor's Institute on Community Design. Prior to his federal appointment, Mr. Speck spent 10 years as Director of Town Planning at DPZ and Company. They were the principal firm behind the new urbanism movement. Since 2007, he has led Speck and Associates. It's a private design consultancy. He's the co-author of Suburban Nation, which Wall Street Journal calls the Urbanist Bible. And his more recent book, Walkable City, was the best-selling city planning title of the last decade. Its sequel, Walkable City Rules, is described by Kurt Anderson as a must-read for urbanists, city builders, and everyone who lives in cities. Quite frankly, I think that that also translates to people who don't live in cities. We all have a lot to learn from these books. His TED Talks and YouTube videos have been viewed more than 4 million times. Mr. Speck, I am happy to have you here. Plan New Hampshire is happy to have you here. We will be talking for about 45 minutes or 40 minutes. Then what we're going to do just before 5 o'clock, we're going to break and we're going to get into small groups. And before you get into your small groups, you'll have an opportunity to make a donation to Plan New Hampshire if you wish to make a significant donation to Plan New Hampshire. And then we'll get into small groups and then we'll get back into a plenary so we can all have a chance to do Q&A and chatting and so forth. So now I turn it over to you, Mr. Speck.
Well, thank you, Robin. And thanks to all of you for inviting me. I haven't been in New Hampshire since the day before yesterday. So thanks for welcoming me back from south of the border and for granting this opportunity to a Massachusetts resident. I know there's other names for us that you have up there, but I'll just say Massachusetts resident and someone who as I'll share, has been coming to New Hampshire for many years. And I want to encourage everyone, of course, to take advantage of New Hampshire Gives Day and to support this very important organization. If you like what you hear today, if you have a good time, please support them even more. And if you don't, please know that they have not vetted my performance at all today. So you can blame me and not them for any content you find unappealing. So I am based in Massachusetts. I work all over the place. This talk is titled Planning That Belongs in New Hampshire because I've been thinking a lot about New Hampshire as I put it together. But I think it's important to share that, I am someone who works, does a lot of plans that don't belong in New Hampshire. And to give a little bit of a self-introduction, I've worked on a lot of new towns, new communities, neighborhood retrofits, a lot of downtown plans. I have a few images I can share of projects that don't belong in New Hampshire, new towns and neighborhoods in Florida, in South Carolina, in Washington, D.C., in Colorado, in Wisconsin, in Mexico, in Belgium, And then a lot of downtown plans. I worked on downtown master plans for Baton Rouge, for Fort Myers. And since founding my own firm about a dozen years ago, the most interesting downtown plan I worked on was quite local, was for Lowell, Massachusetts. And I'll be showing a little bit of that as I go. My connections with New Hampshire are only about 50 years old. This is the small cabin in New Hampshire that I've been going to for the last 47 years. I was thrilled to learn that it's mid-century modern. We didn't know that when my dad bought it almost 50 years ago. And unusually, when I talk in a place, I always go to my photo library and I do a search under that place. And I say, oh, what photos do I have from my visit? Because I've been to all 50 states and I've been to six continents. I've been to most places. The funny thing about this search for today is that most of my pictures have my family in them. So you'll forgive me for doing a little slideshow. This is the view of Pawtuckaway Lake from our deck in New Hampshire. This is me last year. An earlier shot with my older boy, and the fun that happens when you vacation with your kids. So pictures of different parts of New Hampshire I've been to. This is Exeter. Of course, Portsmouth and Concord, where we always stop for a meal on our way up to Bethlehem, where we stay in this lovely B&B and go skiing. Littleton, and of course, the view from Bretton Woods, the wonderful slopes, the mishaps and interesting experiences you have along the way. We have lots of New Hampshire experience. And then this is Derry, which we drive through all the time, and I'll be talking about a little bit more as we move forward, because it's one of many parts of New Hampshire I know quite well. Obviously, I know there's some folks here probably from Vermont or even Maine, and there's a lot to be similar things that I could describe from those places. I have focused this talk entirely on images, at least examples, with one exception from New Hampshire, because it is a planned New Hampshire event. I do want to make it clear, I do not think of Northern New England just as a place for my personal family's enjoyment and recreation. I understand that it's so much more than that. And maybe I'll apologize, but at least acknowledge most of my experience in Northern New England has been strictly pleasure. But I hope you see that as a positive thing, if a limitation to my own knowledge. So I wrote this book, Walkable City, that came out almost 10 years ago, and I'm now writing I'm starting to write a 10th anniversary edition, because it's been such a success in terms of getting cities and towns turned on to the issues of what makes them more walkable and more livable. And I've been giving talks since before it came out on walkable cities. And of course, the word city, it's a very generic term. Of course, I've worked in a lot of cities that have a population of 100, 200 people. It can be a very small rural place, but really, I focus on walkable communities. And I've tended in the past to give talks on why that's so important. And I noticed that the description of this talk that I shared with you earlier was suggested that was one of the subjects I'm going to cover. I also give talks about how to make cities more walkable. I decided as I was putting this together yesterday that the why we need it part, most people kind of understand that already, and I had limited time with you, and I wanted to have the most impact as possible. And you notice I'm going to be rushing, because I always set myself up to present more than I have time to present, and then I go super fast. And if you miss anything, or there's anything you want to hear more about, I'll be sharing some resources at the end where everything is available, and I'm available. So my goal today is to go as quickly as possible. Also, this Why We Need It talk is its own 15-minute talk that you can find at TED.com under the Walkable City. So if you're curious to hear more about why it's so important that we make our communities more walkable, please do go there or look at the other resources on my website. So let's get into how to do it. And I'm going to rush so fast. And there's so many things I want to cover that I couldn't. There's some things that Robin and I talked about beforehand, Robin, that I just don't have time to talk about, but hopefully there'll be opportunity in the Q&A. But my goal now for the next half an hour, actually, I'm going to end with a project I'm doing in New Hampshire, but I want to spend the next half an hour talking about just to lay out as deeply as I can, as quickly as I can, all the things that add up to making
She just
a place walkable. And it adds up to my what I call my general theory of walkability, kind of a tongue-in-cheek term, but the theory asks the question, you know, how in America do you get people to walk? And let me interrupt myself to say, someone isn't muted. So if you are not muted,
is that the building up on Old Church Road?
I think we need to identify who's talking about Old Church Road. But please mute yourself. Back to it. So the general theory of walkability asks the question, particularly in America, where everyone has a car, and I mean, I'm exaggerating, but so many people do, and most people can drive or get someone else to drive them. And driving is so cheap, and the car generally is sitting there in the driveway between you and everything. How do you get people to actually make the choice to walk in a community? And I like to break it down into 4 things that you need to do simultaneously. And this will be the structure of my talk today. The walk needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. So let's drive through those, no pun intended, one by one. The reason to walk is the useful walk. It's about having a reason to get out of the house. And it goes back to a story I learned from my mentors, Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. They founded the New Urbanism movement with some others that I was fortunate to participate in from the beginning. And Andres used to give a talk called The Story of Planning, when he discussed how the cities in the 19th century were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills. And the planners said, hey, let's move the housing away from the offices. And they did, away from the factories. And they did. And the lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And the planners said, hey, this works so well, let's just separate everything from everything else. And thus the onset of Euclidean zoning, the separation of the landscape into these single zone areas. When you look at places that are walkable, they look more like this. Now, this is the most extreme example and technically the most walkable place in America, Manhattan. But look at the difference in the size and mix of uses in a typical suburban environment and a typical urban environment. Clearly, if you want to have a reason to walk, the first step is to have mixed use to the greatest extent possible, which brings us to the kind of the fundamental new urbanist argument, which is basically there are only 2 ways to design communities. Now, there's 1,000 ways to make a town, but there's only 2 ways that we've tested by the thousands. And one is the traditional neighborhood. You may recognize Newburyport, and the other is suburban sprawl. The traditional neighborhood is defined as being walkable, as being compact, and as being diverse. You'll notice places to live, places to work, to worship, to shop, to recreate, all within walking distance. Most of your daily needs are within walking distance. The alternative, of course, is suburban sprawl, which the Sun Belt has perfected, but which exists plenty in New England, not compact, clearly, not diverse, not walkable. Notice there's lots of streets, but only a few of them connect. Most of them are dead ends and loops. And because of that, those few streets that do connect become burdened with a ton of traffic. They're unwalkable. We call them traffic sewers. And you're actually 390% more likely to be hit by a car and killed in this environment than in this environment, even though most of the homes are on a cul-de-sac. So that's the alternative. And it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts of the places you only live, of you only work, you only shop, schools getting bigger and bigger and further apart as a result, and parking lots being larger than the schools because nobody is walking or being bused. It's so spread out, busing doesn't even work, and parents are driving their own kids. You're probably aware of that. And then, of course, if you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, which was created for commerce and for vacation travel, essentially becomes a commuter way. And I always tell people it's a 2-part deal. So for some of us, this is the American dream, right? The house with only other houses around it, but the dream comes with a nightmare. You can't have one without the other, often to absurd extremes. This is a Massachusetts example of, the landscape where you never have to wait more than 1 cycle at a light, because God help you if that would ever happen. Being built. This is the dominant model still being built in the US. Almost everywhere that building is happening, that the sprawl model and the traditional neighborhood model all contain the same stuff: places to live, work, play, recreate. But how big is it? How far apart is it? And do you have this dendritic branching road network system, or do you have a dendritic branching system in which there's only one path from anything to anything else along the collector road? Or do you have a network of small streets which actually give you a dozen different ways to get from this corner? I think it's 21 ways to get from this corner of the drawing to that corner of the drawing, because of that network, which allows each street to be small enough to be walkable. So those are the two models, and it's important as growth occurs in our communities to make sure that we're doing everything we can to push it towards the neighborhood model and not the sprawl model. So that's the reason to walk. And there's more we could talk about, but let's move on. The safe walk is where I spend most of my time, and I do a lot of walkability studies in cities. I just completed one in Mobile, Alabama, where we restripe every street if we can to make it safer. Typically, the streets themselves are what cities control. It's what cities can change very quickly. Of these four things, the useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting walk, the safe walk is the one that you can impact the quickest, and of course, which can have the biggest impact in people's safety and quality of life in communities. It mostly comes down to this image. A car going 35 miles an hour is about 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. And that threshold, of course, is what we experience in most of our communities. What speed are cars driving, and what are the factors that we can use to cause cars to drive, people to drive in cars more slowly, and to protect people from those cars as they drive around? So there's so many I could mention, and I'm going to limit myself to just maybe 6 or 7 of them. The first is block size. The smaller the blocks, the safer the community. This is Portland, Oregon. Famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. This is Salt Lake City, famously less walkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Here they are side by side. Portland on the left, Salt Lake City on the right. You can see the difference. These were built about the same time, all by Americans, but they're remarkably different living experiences. It's crazy to realize that it's actually a factor of 10 that separates pretty walkable older Los Angeles from completely unwalkable Irvine, California, where nobody walks. And then from walker's paradise, Venice, Italy, another 10 times. The number of intersections per mile is a key indicator of how walkable a place you're going to have. And it's also a key indicator of the safety of that place. So if you look at this study of 24 different California cities, you see that when the block size roughly doubles, the number of non-highway fatal crashes almost quadruples. So we definitely want smaller blocks. Of course, in your cities, and I should say, I've given talks in Portland twice and in Manchester twice over the years. Those are the only cities where I've actually gone to speak in New Hampshire, but I have a lot of images from those two places because I did, and I know them pretty well. Downtown Portland, of course, has these lovely small blocks. Portsmouth has these lovely small blocks. Not far away, of course, as in most of our cities, there's the other model, the highway-based gigantic block single-use model, or 2 large uses right next to each other. That is the opposite. And here they are side by side at the same scale, and you can see that both types are quite common, yet entirely different ways of planning, both common in New England. Then you have a place that I think is pretty fascinating, which is Raymond. And I pick Raymond because I've seen Raymond, which is right near Lake Pawtuckaway, and the home of the incredible Tuckaway Tavern, which most of you probably know. But it's a lot more than that. And it has a downtown, which corresponds to the traditional way of organizing a main street. But it also has the part that I'm more familiar with, which is the approach on the highway to the intersection. Here's the Tuckaway Tavern right there. And the left and right you take to get to the lake. And I've watched this area grow over the years and how much it's changed, but it shows the difference between what happens when a place begins as a town and then frankly erodes because the chain retailers locate elsewhere because they want to be where the cars are. And then you watch as an area that was planned as a highway become a downtown without really losing its highway quality. And I think for a smart growth organization, or really anyone that's working in places that are rural and growing, This is the classic dichotomy that we're all struggling with, and the classic problem that America has not yet figured out how to solve, which is given that the national retailers are putting the local ones out of business, and given that the national retailers are drawn to where the cars are, what can we do to reinforce our main streets where they're abandoning, and to not encourage growth in our highways, which frankly should be places for getting through and not arriving at? And you know, the simple answer is that towns and cities and other municipalities need to do everything they can to make sure they're not subsidizing this type of growth, which currently most of them are. And that's the biggest kind of smart growth challenge we face, which is to understand that we have both of these places. And if you want a healthy, walkable community in which that lifestyle is available to people and productive, then the subsidies need to go here, and no subsidies at all should be going into this area, which will do just fine by itself. And also is not a place. It's a collection of places to park, but it's not a place. Next, can you believe all of that was just block size? So moving on, some of your communities, particularly the larger cities, have one-way streets. This is Davenport, Iowa, where my wife is from, but a great example of a multi-lane street that was turned into a multi-lane one-way street. There's almost nothing worse for walkability within a healthy block network than multi-lane one-way streets. The data is now very clear. There's many different studies. I'll show you just one. This is Louisville, where Brook, first, second, and third were all one-way pairs. First and second were converted to First and Brook were reverted back to two-way travel. Second and third were left as one-way streets. The two-ways, car crashes dropped by half. Crime even went down by about a quarter. The one-ways, crashes went up and crime went up. There's lots of data now from lots of different cities. I've done a dozen plans, some more comprehensive than others, that have reverted one-way systems back to two-way in order to make the downtowns more walkable. This is New Albany, Indiana, where I did a plan about 5 years ago, reverting the entire downtown back from one-way. This is across the river from Louisville, back from one-way to two-way. They sat on it for 3 years. The neighbors fought for it. Eventually, when 3 years were up, they completed the reversion. I visited a few years ago, and the police chief, who was originally quite skeptical, as were many people, are now, the police chief, the fire chief, they are now the greatest advocates for this project. And it really did cause a renaissance in that downtown that's been slowed by COVID, but it's now picked up again. It's a much safer outcome, and it's a much more walkable outcome. This is Lowell, Massachusetts, which most of you probably know. It had a number of one-way pairs in its downtown. Our plan reverted them back to two-way. And so a typical street like this, one-way, the opportunity to jockey really speeds the traffic up, is now two-way. And that's also had real impact on not just the safety, but the success of that downtown. So you have towns like Manchester, cities like Manchester, that have a bunch of pairs through them, like Highway 28, like so many state highways, it's split in half into two one-way pairs it's bad for business, it's bad for safety. This is a Manchester crash. And then Portsmouth, of course, has its famous pair of government and state, Congress and state, excuse me, that head to and from the bridge, and could be a lot safer if turned to two-way traffic, which I recommend. I raised an interesting issue in Portsmouth, and I asked this question. It sounds like a rhetorical question, but it was a real question, because I had noticed that Banana Republic had moved in and things were getting pretty shishy, and this is a while ago. And I said, do you really want to improve? Because maybe you don't want to improve to the degree that your downtown becomes so valuable that the local merchants are displaced. Because if you convert these streets to two-way traffic, your retail will do so much better than it might be a situation you don't want. So something to consider, but certainly from a planning perspective, an opportunity. Next, after the direction of travel, is the number of lanes. Sorry, the width of the lanes. I didn't bring up number of lanes. That's something I raise in most cities, but most New England communities, most streets don't have more lanes than they need. It's something we find more towards the Midwest and towards the West, but certainly the width of lanes can be an issue. This is a Western example, but my mentor, Andres Duani, used to show this image complete with the donuts in the middle of the road and say, the typical road, the typical subdivision in America allows you to witness the curvature of the earth. And it's true because the standards have changed from a narrower standard. This is an image from the 60s to a wider standard, one from the 80s. And notice the houses are about the same size, but the standards have just gotten wider and wider and wider. The streets have widened such that even my old neighborhood in Miami Beach, which was working perfectly well, and this street was perfectly safe before, when it wasn't draining properly and they had to rebuild it, the new standard kicked in and they took away our street trees and cut our sidewalk in half just to meet this new standard, which widened the street for no good reason. What happens on wider streets? People drive faster. The data are very clear in that regard. Narrower streets are safer for driving. And NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, a few years ago came out with this bold standard saying we need to go back to 10-foot lanes. Many of our cities have 10-foot lanes, but many cities have allowed it to creep to 12-foot lanes or wider, which is simply not safe. You can find in cities like Manchester this beauty, Granite Street, which these 2 lanes should be 20 feet wide, but they're 28 feet wide. These 3 lanes should be 30 feet wide, but they're 38 feet wide. And what this extra width does is to make it look like a highway, make drivers behave like they're on a highway. And public works departments that are allowing this to happen are encouraging speeding in their communities. So it happens also in Portsmouth, where State Street in this location, it's 3 lanes, it should be 30 feet, it's 41 feet. Anywhere you see this as an opportunity. And of course, on a street like Granite, it's an opportunity for potentially adding parking. You could add parking without reducing the number of driving lanes, or it's an opportunity to add bicycle lanes to the street just by narrowing lanes, not by removing lanes, although removing lanes might make sense in certain locations. Then also in Portsmouth, you have Fleet Street. It's a 2-laner, no parking. So why is it 31 feet wide? It could have 2 nice bike lanes in it, for example, or a flank of parallel parking. So these are opportunities that exist in many of our cities. Broadway, I mentioned Derry. Broadway is a street that could be 30 feet wide, but it is 54.5 feet wide. I drove on this on Sunday. That extra asphalt is an inducement to speed, but it's also an opportunity, right? It's money in the bank that could be used to make some of the parking angle, for example, or to introduce bicycle facilities. So that's the sort of work I do all over the US. So these are the larger, more commercial streets. Of course, local streets, like in this project I managed in Alabama, local streets can be quite different. They can be what we call yield streets. 12 feet between cars parked on both sides of the street is the kind of street you want your kids to grow up on, right? And in lower density areas, that should be the standard. Portland, Oregon introduced a skinny streets standard of that measure. More and more communities are doing it. We want to make sure these sort of details where you can fit 2-way traffic next to a lane of parking in 20 feet or next to 2 lanes of parking in 26 feet. We want to make sure this is legal when people are building new subdivisions. This is ION, a project I worked on in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and the developer, Vince Graham, loves showing this at conferences. He's a great speaker, and he talks about his super narrow 2-way streets, and he mentions this famous philosopher who said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction, narrow is the road that leads to life." And this plays very well in the South, as you might imagine, and it's also true. So here's a neat little trick we discovered about 5 years ago, that when you remove the center line, this is a British example, when you remove the center line from a busy street, the nominal driving speeds drop by about 7 miles an hour. So that's a great way to save lives for the cost of less paint. And then this tremendous example that I'm trying to export from Maine to the rest of the country what they're calling advisory lanes, which is this country road solution where you might have about 25 feet of street, but you take about 16 feet in the center and you mark that as a no center line, two-way travel lane, understanding that people will merge into the side area, which is finally a place for pedestrians and cyclists that was lacking. When a car is coming at them, they can merge. And this is an amazing way to create safety for pedestrians and cyclists on a country road, and also to cause more safety as people drive. Next, I wanted to mention parallel parking, often fought, as a kind of manifestation of the automobile age, on streets where cars are traveling fast in walkable areas. It's really an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. I've been saying that now for over 25 years, learning it from my mentors. But about 10 years ago, I was doing a walkability study in Fort Lauderdale and discovered this street, Hampshire Boulevard, which is a great happy hour street, and noticed you were allowed to park on one side, but not the other, because this was the path out of town. So here was happy hour on the parked side of the street, and here was happy hour on the unparked of the side of the street, because no one wants to sit or stand or walk or be, 5 feet away from cars going 40 miles an hour. And that was the situation we had until I completed my study and we fixed that. The other part of the picture is the street trees. Street trees, which used to be called FHOs by the engineers, fixed hazardous objects, have actually been determined to make streets safer because they cause cars to slow down, sometimes very, very quickly, but better to hit a tree than a person, right? But the street trees next to the street not only protect pedestrians, but they cause people to drive more slowly. So they're also an important factor. And this is a Dutch artist rendition of what a sidewalk feels like when you don't have the parallel parking, don't have the street trees. Signals, this is artwork, but it properly communicates the fact that we are vastly over-signalized in America. And the reason why our towns are over-signalized is because they were once thought to contribute to safety, when now the studies show very clearly that a signalized intersection that could have an always stop sign is harming safety. There was a study in Philadelphia where 472 signals were removed because the state warrants rules changed. And unlike most places, signals that no longer met warrants had to be taken out. And 199 of them were studied. Crashes in general went down when the signals were replaced by all-the-way stop signs. Crashes went down by 1/4, severe injury crashes by a lot more, and severe pedestrian injury crashes by more than 2/3 when signals became stop signs. Whenever I do a downtown study like this one for Albuquerque, I identify which signalized intersections have light enough traffic that they qualify to be replaced by stop signs. This was a plan for Albuquerque where I recommended, I believe, 17 be removed. 11 were removed. And this is a screenshot from the local news station's article, TV news, about what happened, which is that, of course, as always happens with change in cities, people complain dramatically when Silver and Gold Street lost their signals and became stop signs, because the perception was that things were worse. That's how people always react to change. In fact, the data showed the streets were safer. The data also showed that people were getting through the downtown faster. And what this news article comments on is actually the stop signs were brought back as much to improve traffic flow as they were to reduce speeding. Because what happens, of course, is people are stopping at every intersection, but they're never sitting at a light. So it's better for drivers as well as for pedestrians. Cycling, of course, is the biggest revolution currently underway in only some American communities. This is Pittsburgh. This is New York. The real revolution is in the quality of protection to the cycle facility that causes the population of cyclists to move beyond men in their 30s and 40s, which is pretty much where it starts in most communities if you don't protect the cycle track. Here in New York, Prospect Park West, when it was transferred from 3 lanes to 2 lanes plus a cycle track, the number of cyclists tripled, speeding dropped precipitously, injury crashes dropped significantly. Interestingly, the traffic flow on the street was not limited in any way because people were basically speeding and jockeying from light to light, and reducing the capacity of the road did not reduce its throughput, as people just were driving more slowly and safely at basically the same overall speed, but not the same speed between signals. This being New York City, there was a brutal, drawn-out 5-year lawsuit. Eventually, the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality. But I show this image to contrast that experience, that gets your kid cycling, and the circumstance in most cities, like in Washington, D.C., which is doing this as well as this, where no one wants their daughter in the door zone. And so this sort of bike lane that I used to, 10 years ago, I would design as a matter of course in a project, I won't do anymore. And of course, the technology for bike facilities is advancing faster than any other changes we're making in our cities. And so the problem with the unprotected bike lane, of course, that we've identified, not only are you in the door zone, but there's always stuff in it. Trash cans or other things. Daily, I'm lecturing UPS drivers. I'm sure they really appreciate it. I won't tell you what happened last week, but it wasn't pleasant. And of course, something always ends up in the bike lane if it's not protected, including the bike truck in the bike lane. So it's important to understand in terms of who we are serving with these changes. For many years, this was what people thought of when you talked about cycling in our communities, what we call the mammal, the middle-aged man in Lycra. Technically, it's much more likely to be this person. And a really important discussion to have when you're arguing for better and safer bike facilities in your community is that fully 39% of people who are cycling to work are from the poorest 25% of your income earners. So an investment in bike facilities is an investment in equity, and it's an investment in having the city that works for more people. So that's important to understand. Weather, of course, is a factor. This is Copenhagen, where more people bike than just about anywhere else in the world. And of course, it isn't always like this, but I love sharing this graph with people, which is a study of the American states from the hottest to the coldest, summer temperatures and winter temperatures. And then this completely unrelated chart of how much people are cycling, which peaks in Oregon, and communicates the most important thing, which is that cycle population is impacted by weather. It is impacted by topography. It is impacted by culture. But actually, the way to build a bike culture that's stronger than any of that is to invest in protected cycle facilities. And when you invest in protected cycle facilities, the weather becomes almost statistically insignificant in terms of determining how many people will be biking, because there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear. And then, of course, I have to end the safety segment with saying, well, what could be better for safety and for livability and walkability than a street like this one in Burlington that has no cars on it? And that is true. But as you consider pedestrianizing streets in your community, just remember to test it first. A mistake that about 180 American communities made 30 years ago, really 40 years ago, was they did it without testing it. So you want to start small, see if it works for a weekend, then see if it works for a week, and eventually pedestrianize away as much as you can, but test it as you go. Now, as you may have noticed, the safe walk was the biggest category. There's so much to say. I want to move on, though, to these two last quick categories, the comfortable walk and the interesting walk. We love spaces that have edges. We want to occupy outdoor living rooms. A plaza, be it traditional or modern, is only as good as its edges. And we've been studying that for many years. We urban designers, know that a place won't be occupied if it isn't well contained. People just don't like to be there. Once you get beyond 6 to 1, you don't really feel enclosed anymore. 1 to 1 was the Renaissance ideal. Trees can help a lot. 6 6-to-1 in the vertical dimension can be incredible. This is Salzburg. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. And this part of Houston has improved tremendously since this photo from around 1990. But we are reminded that it's the surface parking lot that's the principal villain in this conversation, and we need to make sure that our streets are shaped well without them. Of course, all the great places in the world that we want to go to on vacation, if it's not nature, then it's streets that shape. Look at the difference right between the two. Streets that are so tight you can't see out of them. You know, plazas that you can't see out of, like this. This is Florence, where I lived for 2 years. This is Madrid, where I've never been and just can't wait to go to experience this enclosed plaza in the center. And I have so many wonderful photos of just brilliantly shaped spaces from all around the world, from both hemispheres. Triangular shapes are great because they really shut the space down more tightly. This is one of the places I worked on that I showed earlier. It's in Washington. You know, triangular plazas hold us so well. And then in our communities like Manchester, it is those streets that have buildings on both sides that are tall enough that are the most successful at drawing us together. And then we notice the missing teeth, the really important places, like where the bridge from Kittery lands in Portsmouth, and this missing tooth here, which is terminating the view down this street improperly. The whole space is just bleeding and not properly held. And I had suggested to citizens there that the best investment anyone could make in Portsmouth would be to find a way to put a building on this site, which would terminate this street, which would terminate all these views, and make a nice entry into New Hampshire from Maine. And then finally, the interesting walk. I said that 1-to-1, it was the Renaissance ideal. This is 1-to-1. This is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is a very walkable downtown, but no one wants to walk on this street between the two main hotels, because when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a conference facility, apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck, it's just too boring, right? No one wants to be bored. Mayor Riley in Charleston, South Carolina, mayor for 40 years, taught us it only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 feet of parking. This is another example, preserved Art Deco storefronts in front of what I call the Chia Pet Garage in South Beach, near where I lived for 10 years. Here in Portsmouth, there's an opportunity to place a liner of thin buildings, thicker than a house I lived in very happily in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. It only takes about 12 feet to have a really nice room, and therefore really nice houses that could block this edge. And then thinking more deeply about interesting spaces and charming spaces and what gives character and interest to different places around the world. What causes us to choose to travel to them, right? For a place like Northern New England that gets a lot of its revenue from vacation travelers, what causes people to want to come there? And I discovered, as I was working on a project in Derry that I'm about to show you, I probably just Googled beautiful historic streets and I came across this article of the most charming streets in America, showing this one in Philadelphia, also Philadelphia, Charleston, the Rainbow Row, Washington, D.C. And notice each one is, they're different from each other in really fascinating ways that make you know that you're in a different part of the country when you travel. Probably most of you immediately recognize San Francisco. This happens to be Providence, right? It could also be any number of places in Eastern New England. Boston, Beacon Hill, of course, and then places that have their own characteristic quality, like Provincetown with these gables and these L-shaped houses that you see throughout. What is it that makes a place internally consistent and unique and want us to visit it to see something different? And it has to do with really two things at once. It deals with locally derived and climatically derived building details, like the pitch of the roof and the proportion of the windows, the materials that are available locally, and then also having many different people do the buildings, which adds up to a variety within that unity. And I kind of started to fall in love with these roughly 45 degree pitch roof houses that we see in New Hampshire and Vermont. And then, of course, with great collections of buildings like Shaker Village near Portsmouth, Shaker Village a bit north, Canterbury Village, and then the other Strawberry Bank in Portsmouth. And also color, which people just love, right? I mean, if you can pull it off in an authentic way, a variety of colors is also something that attracts us here in this colorized photo, emphasized even more. And what that might mean in terms of inspiring a new place in New England that feels like New England, but also kind of celebrates and tries to get the essence of our unique place. So that's the list, and you really need to do all four of these things at once, and that's the challenge that faces us when we're trying to draw people to new places. So, in my remaining last few minutes, I just want to show quickly I am working on one project in New Hampshire. It's a site that holds the oldest house in New Hampshire, and one of the developers, Mark Siragusa, I know is participating in today's Zoom. And it's a roughly 10-acre site that's on Main Street, that's just south of the main highway through Derry. You probably know it. You take the roundabout, head south just a little bit, and here you are. And here is the oldest house in Derry. Here's a schoolhouse that was built more recently, but has some traditional features. And then an early 19th century house here. The rest is largely empty and available. And the question is, driven by a client that wanted to build a mixed-use destination, a place that would have all the aspects of daily life as was possible within a small 10-acre site, and wanted to create the sort of energy that comes from living, working, shopping, walking, right, enjoying events, all in one location, and creating kind of a second place to be besides the main street in Derry. What could that mean? And I came up with this plan that I won't, one of many plans, and the one that we've landed on so far, but it's still evolving. The goal of creating a network of small streets, some vehicular, some pedestrian, a secondary network of parking streets where the parking is hidden. So the buildings are very thin. So the parking can be in the middle of the block and hidden from view, as I described. This is an existing parking lot that we're just turning into a parking street by giving it a proper sidewalk, which it currently lacks. And then the majority of the parking hidden again behind buildings conveniently at the edge of the site, where there's this extra space where we can put a ton of parking and not have it be seen. And then I'm going to rotate the plan because I'm about to show it to you in perspective. So there you have it. Existing buildings here and here, existing parking lot turned into kind of a two-sided head park Main Street, which has room for offices and higher density housing and potentially some lower income housing as well, which is welcomed as a component of the plan. You have single family homes here. Actually, these are two per chunk. So 2 homes, 2 homes, 2 homes. Here you have townhomes all parked from behind against this alley space that I showed you. So with front doors against Main Street, with front doors against this secondary pedestrian street. And then here actually currently in the plan as apartments, but they look like houses. The street is oriented to center on this building, which receives a cupola in a proper spot on the roof, learning from Beacon Hill, learning from Provincetown and other places, narrow pedestrian street, nice injection of color to give it some character. And then further down, a Main Street component where shops are placed along one side of the street, restaurants along the other side of the street, and then beyond a beautiful tilted lawn for concerts and other things. And then a large apartment building, which also contains an event venue at its base along this one edge. So here's an impression of the Main Street with the retrofitted farmhouse. The oldest house in Derry is here. These are new shops along the street. This archway leads you into the parking that's hidden behind these buildings here. And this is a project that is moving forward, a really interesting mix of places to live, work, recreate, shop to make it a real village. And I'm very excited to see what the next steps of this project will be. So that sums up my talk. I wanted to end as I'd promised by sharing a few resources. Walkable City is the book that's the best-selling book for getting people who don't really know that much about planning excited about planning. So if there are people you're trying to convert to caring about the design of our towns and cities, this book was written for that reason. My newer book that was mentioned, Walkable City Rules, is more for people who are doing the work. So if you are active in this space professionally or as an activist, this book is much more detailed, has many more pictures and measurements and tools for you to use. A typical of the 101 steps, a typical step looks like this: road diet your four-laners, and all this evidence of four-laners that became three-laners without losing their traffic capacity. And then the rule: don't build four-lane roads and convert your four-lane roads to 3 lanes. That's been learned from that. I mentioned the TED Talk. There's another one that's much more like this talk. So this one is called 4 Ways to Make a City More Walkable. It's even more popular than the other one. And it's a short version of what you just heard today, if you want a 15-minute version for your friends. And then finally, because you guys are so close, I teach a 2-day class at Harvard every summer, except for last summer and this summer. Starting next year, get in touch with me via my website. It's a 2-day course that is just 2 days of this plus walking around Boston. And all these resources are available at my website, which is jeffspeck.com. So I almost kept on time, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm looking forward to the breakout, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A that comes after that.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fabulous. That was so great. Thank you so much. We'll have a chance in a few minutes to ask questions of each other. But right now, we're going to be putting you into small breakout rooms. But while we're organizing that, we invite you to make a donation to Plan New Hampshire. New Hampshire Gives has now officially started at 5 o'clock. And if we invite you to go in, Stephanie, I think, was going to put the link, in the chat, to where you can go to make a donation. Your donation will be matched dollar for dollar up to $5,000. We have a pool of $5,000 from our board. So every donation that you make, they will match it dollar for dollar until that $5,000 is gone. So we invite you to please give generously. In addition, the 2 of you who give the most, over $100, who have the largest donations between now and 5:30, will get a copy of Jeff Speck's Walkable City Rules. I have it waiting for me at my bookstore, and we will send it to you. But really, I hope that those 2 incentives are enough. So please go to your chat box, click on the link, and please make a donation to Plan New Hampshire and be generous. Brian Garris, are you in the room? Would you like to say anything? Brian is the president of the Plan New Hampshire board. Would you like to add anything? And I'm going to start looking at the breakout rooms.
Yeah, no, I'm here. I've been listening. Enjoyed this very much, Jeff. I want to thank you for working with us on this. I think it's a great event to track interest in your talks, but also in Plan New Hampshire, and draw some attention at this time of the year when we're looking for some donations to help us succeed and continue to bring programs like this to New Hampshire. So I appreciate your help.
Yes, thank you. So what we're going to do now is, as you're making your donations, we have created some breakout rooms for you to go into. We're going to open the rooms and you'll be invited in. You will just click on join, and it's just an open conversation. Chat with each other, briefly introduce yourselves, and then chat with each other about what you just heard. What came up for you? What was there an aha moment? Did it spark anything? Did you say, oh, it reminded me of the time, or we're trying to do this, or whatever? And we'll have about 10 minutes to do that. And then we'll come back into this big room here, and we can all chat with each other. So undo your video, or let your video start going again, and unmute yourselves and go ahead into your rooms. So if you all want to, unless you've got dogs barking and stuff, if you all want to unmute and show your faces, we can just have a general conversation. We're going to stop hard at at just before 5:30. Thanks to each and every one of you who has made a donation so far to Plan New Hampshire. If you have not yet, you still have until 5 tomorrow. However, the two of you who donate more than $100, the most amount of money of over $100 between 5 o'clock and 5:30 will receive a copy of Jeff Speck's Walkable City Rules from us, and we'll send it to you. But so there's that incentive still going.
Could you repeat the process of donating?
There's Stephanie, can you put that back in the chat again? There is, sir, if you look in the chat down below where it says chat and there's a little one that just popped up, there's a link there that says newhampshiregives.org. Just click on there and that will take you to our donation page and explain a little bit about who we are and how much you can donate. And it's very easy. It's very, very easy. So thank you to all of you who have donated so far. Now let's just open it up. Let's open it up for discussion. Does anybody have any comments, any questions? We have Jeff Speck here for another 10 minutes, 12 minutes, and let's take advantage. So anybody?
Well, one thing that was not talked about was unwilling developers.
There are plenty of those. You know, in most places I've worked, and most places that see the most great development, the vast majority of the development community is still doing what they used to do. There's a term that developers have for doing anything at all different from the way that they've always done it, and that's called brain damage. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but I've heard it many times. They don't like to be given brain damage, but in fact, when you do something for many years and it's profitable, you have no reason to stop. So or change. So that's why I mentioned early on, we need to look very carefully at what incentives, if any, exist in terms of what our towns, villages, and cities are making profitable. And from a smart growth perspective, and I was on the board of the parallel organization in Washington, D.C. when I lived there. From the perspective of a smart growth organization, one of the most effective things you can do is to investigate to see if any forms of kind of overt or hidden subsidies exist that are making it more profitable to develop in the wrong places. That is often the case. The probably the most successful smart growth governor historically was Paris Glendening, who was governor of Maryland, and he came out very clearly saying, developers are welcome to sprawl, cities are welcome to sprawl, and towns in Maryland, we're just not going to help pay for it. And if the state isn't showing that kind of leadership, then it's up to folks in the individual communities to do what they can to help.
Great, thank you. Yes, we had Mr. Glendening came and spoke at a conference of ours about 3 or 4 years ago. It was great to have him.
Yes,
Anybody else? Who else? Ivy. Hey, Ivy.
Hey, I was going to say, we were talking the Yield Street that you showed, the one in Scarborough, Maine. There's also, there are a couple in Lincoln, Vermont now, down in front of the elementary school. My son lives in Lincoln, and I pulled off the side of the road to take a picture of that street. And someone noted in the chat, there's also one in Hanover. I have been unsuccessful in getting any of them in my town, and the pushback I get is, well, we would have to repaint it every year. And so I don't know how you argue with that, but I do think that particularly for towns in New Hampshire that have, as we all do, little country roads that people walk on, that those streets are just that striping is hugely helpful. So
well, I think for a local highway, those tend to have the double yellow line in the middle. So all you're really doing is moving the yellow lines to the flank, and the truck's got to get back at the end of the day. So really, it's no extra travel for the painting truck.
That is good to remember. We have gone to not having a center line. We get 2 fog lines now. I did manage to sell them on that idea. So we press on.
Jeff, we have this new experiment unfolding in front of us right now in lots of towns, probably throughout the world, but especially here in New England, right here in Portsmouth, where I am, where we're converting parking stalls over to eating places, and we're, kind of ad hoc converting our, outdoor spaces into more people-friendly spaces. I know it takes time for you to digest and process and turn that around for wisdom for the rest of us, but are you seeing anything that you'd care to comment on right now as you're processing it?
Well, if I was a little more on the ball and had more time, I would have brought up, I have a whole segment on COVID in streets, as you might expect. And in fact, I had to give a talk. I offered and was accepted. I gave a talk to the Boston City Council on opportunities that was presenting that had some impact on, a lot of good things were done in Boston regarding not just converting parking lanes to parklets, but liquor licenses and other things that the rules needed to change to get the quick turnaround. And we saw similar things happening in Brookline, where I live, and lots of communities. I think the real question is, and it's going to come down to a lot of public advocacy and feet on the ground. The question is, in those communities that had the wherewithal and the activists and perhaps the merchants to cause that to happen, right? To cause lots of things to happen, not just parking lanes turned into dining lanes, but also perhaps extra traffic lanes turned into parking lanes so the sidewalks could widen and other things like that. Bike lanes inserted where there hadn't been bike lanes before, right? This happened in a lot of places due to COVID. How vocal and how vocal can we be, and how much advocacy can we put out on the street and at City Council to stop those from going away? So I'm kind of stating the obvious. I heard an interesting story about Portsmouth, and we can get deeper into it perhaps after this event, but I heard that there was a single protected bike lane built in Portsmouth and that someone got doored in it, which makes me think there wasn't a proper buffer between the bike lane and the curb. Normally there's the bike lane and the door. Normally there's the curb, then the bike lane or lanes, then a buffer zone, and then the car door. And when you take an in-street bike lane and move it in between the parked cars and the curb, you can't leave out that buffer zone. And somehow someone got doored. Makes me think that the buffer zone was missing, and then the bike lane was removed. And that's unfortunate, but I'm curious if there are stories like that that we could learn from. I don't know if, Brian, if you know anything about it. But.
Well, it runs, of course, as in every community, it runs a little deeper than just the pragmatics and the technicalities of the design, although that design issue may have been at play. It's a little bit more political and cultural here, and as I'm sure you've seen before. By the way, a small detail about that biker getting doored story, the car was not legally parked as I understood it, and it may have even happened not in the bike lane.
Okay.
So that was just the kind of, the first stroke that started the whole thing unraveling, but there was more behind what got the bike lane removed, unfortunately.
Doing this stuff is so hard, accomplishing the walkability and the principles of new urbanism. You mentioned Boston before. I look at the whole new area of South Boston that's been redeveloped where the wards used to be 20 years ago. And here is Boston, one of the great world-class cities with many, many examples of wonderful design, Beacon Hill and Back Bay and the South End. And they just did such a miserable job in that new part of the town, not having walkability and mixed use and good scale and parks and greenways and street trees and, retail. I mean, just a miserable job, which is really discouraging, points to how difficult it is. But, it's all the more difficult in New Hampshire. In our breakout group, was talking with somebody from Lyme, New Hampshire, which is very small. Probably they don't want to grow. They have a beautiful green, but they probably don't know how to redesign it. Anyway, my question is, this stuff's hard and it's complex. How do you make it happen at all scales, particularly in a state like New Hampshire that's rural, is afraid of development, maybe doesn't have the critical mass of staff, education, changing the paradigm? So how do you do it?
Well, not every project is successful, and I have the advantage of working all over the country, so I go where people want these changes, and so I have the real benefit of trying to do this work in places that at least a lot of people are ready for it. But I should say, I have a very specific strategy that I'm a little bit ambivalent about, because I know that, we all know that for the climate and for the planet, ultimately people need to drive less. We all know that. But if you position the addition of alternative transportation, it's so funny that walking is called alternative, but if you position the introduction of walking and biking as somehow a degradation to driving, in most communities you won't succeed. Even Boston, which is, a Kyoto Accord city that believes in being as green as possible, we will be doing a massive transformation to Kenmore Square, outside of Fenway Park, where we had to demonstrate that the amount of cars moving through the intersection would be no fewer than before, or it was a non-starter. So what I've found, and this is particularly applicable in the places I work, like red states, that you have to find the opportunities where you can present the introduction of alternative facilities as no degradation of the automobile experience. And I've been very successful in finding extra lanes, if not extra lanes, extra wide lanes, or roads that perhaps aren't where the cycle planner would have put the cycle lane, but actually a road that has room for the cycle lane, and so it can go in without creating a huge opposition among what I call the automotive hordes. So very often it just has to do with kind of ambivalently acknowledging the continued dominance of the automobile, but finding places where the alternative still fits.
Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time, we're going to respect the 5:30 ending time. Thank you again, Jeff, for being here with us today. Thank you to AIA New Hampshire for their wonderful support of this particular event, to the New Hampshire Planners Association, to Make Architects, and to Bob White. This has been fabulous, and thanks to each and every one of you for being here. If you have not yet made a donation, please do so. If you have made a donation, thank you so much. I hope that we can do this again at some point. If you're not a member of Plan New Hampshire, look into it, plannh.org, and look at the membership information. Or at least join our mailing list and find out what we're up to. But this is a great example of what we are up to, is trying to make our cities and towns and villages healthy and vibrant. And part of that, a big part of that, is by making them walkable and safe and interesting for everybody. So again, thank you, Jeff Speck. Thanks to each and every one of you for being here. Thanks to Heather for helping me put this together, to Stephanie for being behind the scenes and helping with the tech. And you all have a great evening and stay out of the storm. Thank you.